For years, they oversaw the greatest extermination apparatus ever created by humankind. They ordered, planned, and executed the deaths of millions. They were the commanders of the Nazi concentration camps. But when the Third Reich fell, an inevitable question arose: what became of them? How did the architects of the horror that caused so many deaths face justice? Today we explore their stories, their decisions, and their ultimate fate. To understand the destiny of these men, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, to where the first bricks of the most lethal system of the 20th century were laid: the birth of the Nazi camp system. The first concentration camps were erected in Germany in February 1933. These camps were primarily used to house and torture political opponents and trade union organizers. They held around 45,000 prisoners, and during the mid to late 1930s their number expanded considerably. When SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler took control of the concentration camp system throughout Germany, he began using the camp facilities and personnel to supposedly purge German society of so-called racially undesirable elements such as Jews, criminals, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, and any other elements deemed a threat to the Nazi regime. The camps were administered by the Concentration Camp Inspectorate, which in 1942 was merged into the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office and the Totenkopfverbände. By 1940, the situation in the concentration camps had become untenable due to new policies for the arrest and detention of enemies of the state. News was already circulating through SS channels that government officials were demanding immediate measures to expand the concentration camp system throughout Germany and its newly conquered territory, Poland. The German authorities rushed to establish several camps where those arrested could be incarcerated and put to work as stonemasons and construction workers for buildings and streets. It was anticipated that these individuals would remain as slave labor, so it was deemed necessary to erect so-called quarantine camps to subdue the local population. Initially, it had been proposed that the quarantine camps would house prisoners until they were sent to the other concentration camps in the Reich. However, it soon became clear that this was entirely impractical. Therefore, approval was given for these camps to operate as a permanent prison for all those unfortunate enough to be sent there. The thousands of concentration camps built across Europe functioned very well together, despite the brutality of their commandants. Under their strict command, several camps were built by the inmates themselves. Daily, prisoners were forced to work in all weather conditions, often without rest, continually subjected to atrocious brutality. Despite the conditions, the commandants were determined that the prisoners would complete the barracks, no matter how. Most of the buildings constructed served simply to house and provide for the basic needs of the prisoners, the guards, and the SS personnel who ran the camp. Once the camps were built, some were used not only to incarcerate the prisoners but to force them into slave labor. This involved forcing them to work within the camp itself or transferring them to various subcamps where they worked in factories, often for large German companies. This was very lucrative for the SS and the companies involved. As the concentration camp system grew and new policies evolved, some camps were converted into labor and extermination camps. Other extermination camps were also built, their sole function being murder. As a direct response to the growing demand at the concentration camps, the SS needed civilian experts to help install heating systems, electrical equipment, and sewage systems, as well as to construct chimneys and other buildings such as crematoria. Many civilian companies were professionally involved in genocide, and many of them were eager to produce goods for the SS in exchange for financial reward. Concentration camp commandants were the men in charge of many of the mass extermination camps, where they often ordered the murder of tens of thousands of people. Most commandants were eager to please and eager to demonstrate to their superiors that they were great innovators in the way they organized the extermination process. They often carried out their colossal extermination tasks like competent businessmen. For example, in just 3 years after taking over as commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss had turned the once peaceful and isolated complex into the largest mass murder factory in world history. But behind this barbarity, Höss was a husband and a father. Just outside the main camp at Auschwitz, Höss's wife and their well-cared-for children lived in more or less harmony. There he baked cakes, cooked homemade German dishes, ensured the gardens were lovingly tended, and the wine cellar was well stocked. Every day Rudolf came home after a hard day planning the slaughter of thousands of people, and yet it was clear that he had a hard time fulfilling his task. He often slipped away at night and stood in the gas chambers, forced to think of his wife and children without connecting them to the horrors occurring nearby. But despite the constant pressure, Höss, like so many other commanders, remained obsessed with orders and obedience to the very end. The commanders firmly believed that no one else could have performed as well as they had in such terrible circumstances. In the end, as they awaited sentencing for their crimes, no surprises could shake their conviction that in their judgment they had always acted well and had performed their duty conscientiously, attentively, and to the satisfaction of all. The story of the concentration camp commandants, from their inception to the mass murder of millions of innocent souls, is a captivating narrative and a valuable contribution to Holocaust studies. It is a disturbing portrait of some of the most infamous men of the Nazi regime and an incredible insight into the minds of the mass murderers. Theodor Eicke, the SS general who organized the Nazi concentration camps. Waffen-SS staff meetings, the commander of the Death's Head formations demanded that he be provided with additional equipment and personnel. His superiors replied that he would have to make do with what he had. The commander did not budge. He defended his position vocally and emotionally, shocking those present. At one point, the man stood up from his place, drew his pistol, and threatened to kill himself on the spot at the conference table if he was not granted what he wanted. His superiors quickly promised that they would review his request. The man's name was Theodor Eicke. In his mind, he and the Nazi movement were one. Its struggles were his personal struggles, its failures his personal failures, and its prestige his personal prestige. This was dearer to him than all else. He aspired at every turn to glorify it. He defended it with unbridled enthusiasm and pedantic pugnacity. Eicke was as arrogant, impulsive, and uninhibited as his movement, a true fighter, his family said of him. At any time, in peace or war, with his unit or at home, he was always on the front lines. He lived through his own wars. The Nazi Party newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, described him as a political soldier with a stormy heart, and Adolf Hitler considered him a model of self-sacrifice. There was something of the gladiator in him, the man who fights for glory and money, something of the desperate man who lives to fight. A dangerous man, he said of himself. His opponents said he was crazy. His men admired him. They called him Papa Eicke in awe, as if he were their father. He was good at cultivating their pride. "There are no better fighters in the SS than us," he boasted to them. "There is no one bolder or tougher than us. Germany could not hold out for a single day without us." These were the things he would tell his comrades. Serving under him was, in his view, a great privilege. He frequently warned his men that anyone who failed to meet the high level of achievement demanded by the skull formations or to adopt a sense of mission would be transferred to other SS units. He did his best to make his men understand that being transferred out of their formation was the most degrading personal failure possible. In one of his routine orders, Eicke described what a man expelled could expect. "The man will be demoted in front of his comrades. It is doubtful he can bear the shame involved. A man expelled from the skull formation loses his place in an elite unit." Eicke had a tendency to exaggerate. Some of these sanctions applied only to men expelled from the SS as a whole, not to those transferred from the Totenkopf formations to other units in the organization. Some of the threats were purely a product of his imagination. This was his way of keeping his men on their toes, improving them and boosting his image. His men believed him and did their best not to be expelled. New SS members were simply placed in a specific unit, and that was it. They weren't asked which unit they wanted to be in. This may well have been the case during the war. SS archives contain documents attesting that men were sometimes forced to volunteer for the organization against their will. However, this wasn't the way things were done before the war. Those who enlisted in the Totenkopf formations knew well that they would be serving in concentration camps. They were explicitly told this. Members of the formations volunteered to serve there of their own free will, and even went through rigorous acceptance tests designed to select the best candidates. Shortly after arriving at Dachau, Eicke developed clear ideas about the type of men he needed. He generally began by getting rid of almost everyone he encountered at Dachau upon his arrival, police officers and SA officers, most of them 25 or 30 years old. Some of them had even served in World War I. They were adventurers, ordinary people with dubious backgrounds, and men of dubious mental stability. Eicke looked for more solid, younger types with a higher degree of motivation and idealism. He couldn't stand the police or the SA. According to the selection criteria he drafted, applicants for the Totenkopf formations had to prove that their desire to serve in the SS was genuine. It required appropriate moral, spiritual, physical, racial, and ideological talents that would enable them to meet the organization's demands. The skull formations were made up of career men. Most of them were salaried employees who served as guards and administrative staff in concentration camps. There were also units stationed outside, but in close proximity to the concentration camps. These stopped their regular exercises only once every 3 weeks and spent from a week to 10 days on guard duty in the camps. The first Totenkopf unit was established in 1933 at Dachau immediately after Eicke took command of the camp. At first, these units numbered only a few hundred men. A year after their creation, they still numbered no more than 2,000. However, their number doubled by December 1935, and by the end of 1937, it had risen to 7,000. In the summer of 1938, when the number of those serving in the Death's Head formations had risen to 10,000, Adolf Hitler signed a secret order stating that in peacetime the formations would be assigned special duties of a police nature, or in other words, the operation of concentration camps. In the event of war, the Führer declared, the Totenkopf formations would reinforce the militarized formations of the SS, what would later become the Waffen-SS. For this reason, they were also to be provided with military training and weapons and other battle equipment. Totenkopf units participated in the annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia. On the eve of World War II, some 15,000 men served in them, roughly half of the total SS membership. When the war broke out, thousands more Allgemeine SS men were recruited to create a dozen new Totenkopf formations. They performed, among other duties, policing in occupied territory, mass deportations, and executions. Simultaneously, 6,500 career members of the Death's Head formations were sent to the front. They, along with other men, formed a combat division under the command of Theodor Eicke, the Totenkopf Division. At the outbreak of World War II, under Eicke's command, they participated in the French and Low Countries campaigns, fighting fanatically and suffering heavy losses. There, they would commit some of their first wartime crimes. The SS Totenkopf Division saw action several times during the invasion of France. In mid-April 1941, the division was ordered east to join Army Group North. Under Eicke's command, the division was ordered to advance toward Leningrad as the northern wing of Operation Barbarossa. They fought in Latvia and Lithuania, and in July crossed the infamous Stalin Line. The division then advanced to Demyansk, where they were involved in fierce fighting. During one of these operations, the division was encircled for several months near Demyansk in what would become known as the Demyansk Pocket. Around 80% of its soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in action. The remnants of the division were withdrawn from combat in late October 1942 and sent to France for refitting. In early February 1943, the Totenkopf Division was reassigned to the Eastern Front as part of Army Group South. As part of the SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser, it took part in the Third Battle of Kharkov, countering the Soviet offensive. Finally, during these battles, the man who organized the concentration camps, SS Obergruppenführer Theodor Eicke, was killed on 26 February 1943 during aerial reconnaissance in preparation for the so-called Third Battle of Kharkov. His plane, a Fieseler Fi-156, was shot down by the Red Army near Attelneu. His troops immediately launched an attack to reach the crash site and recover the body of their commander. Nazi propaganda raised Theodor Eicke as a hero. Shortly after his death, one of the Totenkopf Division's regiments was named Theodor Eicke. His military reputation, however, was compromised. Josef Kramer, the infamous and last commander of Bergen-Belsen. On March 21, 1933, Josef Kramer read in the Völkischer Beobachter, the Nazi Party's morning newspaper, reported that the following day, Wednesday, a concentration camp would open about 14 kilometers north of Munich. The local police chief declared at a press conference that the camp, the first of its kind, would have space for 5,000 inmates. The camp buildings had been a gunpowder factory during World War I. Not far away, at the foot of an ancient castle, lay the town of Dachau. Newspapers reported the news of the camp's opening discreetly. Outside of Germany, it aroused limited interest. Josef Kramer was a 27-year-old unemployed electrician living in Augsburg. He was a member of the Nazi Party and had already served as a volunteer in the SS for 6 months. Beobachter reported that the Dachau concentration camp had been established as part of the redoubled efforts to eliminate communist subversion. Kramer was pleased, for he hated communists. 2 years after reading about the opening of Dachau, he joined its staff. He served in concentration camps for over a decade. During this time, camps were established all over Europe. They expanded and became more brutal year after year. Kramer was part of this development from the beginning and grew accustomed to it gradually, step by step, from Dachau to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. When British Army soldiers entered Bergen-Belsen in 1945, they found 60,000 prisoners wasting away from hunger and disease, many of them on the verge of insanity. Tens of thousands of bodies lay strewn among the barracks. There were signs that some had been eaten. Going back in time, the night before the Dachau camp was opened, several Communist Party sympathizers were marched to prison at another abandoned munitions plant near Oranienburg, 9 miles north of Berlin. In the future, Nazi propaganda authorities would occasionally allow outside visitors, journalists, and representatives of foreign embassies to visit the site. In those days, there was still confusion about the internment. No one knew for sure who was responsible for what. Within weeks of Hitler's rise to power, the regular prisons were overcrowded. As the arrests continued from Berlin to Munich, the need for new prison facilities arose. Before the establishment of official concentration camps, makeshift prisons sprang up all over Germany, erected on their own initiative by the SA and Schutzstaffel SS in abandoned factories, athletic fields and farms, to confine and sometimes annihilate their enemies. Even before the Nazis took power, the brown-shirt hooligans routinely kidnapped anyone who betrayed them personally: debtors, business competitors, troublesome neighbors, and even family members. These activities were part of the general atmosphere of lawlessness that pervaded Germany in the final days of the Weimar Republic. During the final stages of the war, prisoners evacuated from the camps in the east were transferred there just before they fell into Russian hands. In June 1943, Himmler ordered that the Warsaw prison also be given concentration camp status. The ghetto no longer existed at that time, having been almost completely destroyed during the famous uprising that shook it that spring. When Josef Kramer wrote before his death that he had traveled a long way from Dachau to Bergen-Belsen, he was speaking from his own experience. He started reasonably, from his point of view. From May 1940 to November 1940, Josef Kramer was an adjutant to Rudolf Höss at the Auschwitz concentration camp and then completed his training as a protective custody camp leader at the Dachau concentration camp until April 1941. Immediately afterwards, he was deployed as a protective custody camp leader at the Natzweiler-Struthof concentration camp in Alsace, and from February 1942 he worked as acting commandant before being promoted to camp commandant there in October 1942. Under him, the German Ancestral Heritage Research Association built a gas chamber at the Natzweiler-Struthof concentration camp for human experiments, which he reported completed on 12 April 1943. In August 1943, he had 86 prisoners transferred from the Auschwitz concentration camp and gassed there to complete anatomy professor August Hertz's famous Collection of Skulls and Skeletons at the Reich University of Strasbourg. Kramer directed this murder operation and watched the victims' agonies through a window. By the spring of 1943, he had been awarded the War Merit Cross, second class. In May 1944, Kramer became commandant of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, succeeding Friedrich Hartenstein, who was in turn transferred to the Natzweiler-Struthof concentration camp. At that time, Oswald Pohl, as head of the WVHA or head of the SS main offices, ordered a change in the camp commandants assigned to the Auschwitz concentration camp complex, and at the same time appointed Rudolf Höss as the site's commander. From this point on, the so-called Hungary Action, the murder of hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews, began under Höss's leadership. The gas chambers and crematoria were located at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, and SS Hauptscharführer Otto Moll was directly responsible for them. Kramer experimented on Auschwitz survivor Olga Lengyel during a selection in the women's camp infirmary, where, according to her testimony, he cracked a prisoner's skull with one blow of a club while loading victims onto trucks. In the course of the merger of the Auschwitz concentration camp with the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp under the direction of Richard Baer, Kramer was transferred to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp and assumed direction of the camp there on 2 December 1944, succeeding Rudolf Höss. He took some of his previous staff with him to Bergen-Belsen. Under his leadership, self-administration for Jewish prisoners was abolished in the so-called Sternlager. Jewish prisoners were removed from specially protected work sites and replaced by non-Jewish prisoner officials who immediately introduced a reign of terror. Furthermore, the living conditions of Jewish prisoners deteriorated due to reduced food rations and overcrowding in the prisoner barracks. Under Kramer's command, conditions in the camp descended into unimaginable horror, to which most of the Belsen prisoners fell victim, primarily due to exhaustion and typhus. Towards the end of the war, Bergen-Belsen became the target of several evacuation transports from other concentration camps, as a result of which the camp became completely overcrowded and epidemics claimed large numbers of lives. Shortly before the camp was liberated, Kramer had the files in the commandant's office destroyed and instructed the exhausted prisoners to clean up the thousands of corpses lying around the camp grounds. In January 1945, he had been awarded the War Merit Cross, First Class. On 15 April 1945, the British Army's 11th Armoured Division occupied the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp without a fight as part of a local armistice negotiated with the Wehrmacht, which was handed over as neutralised territory. Colonel Taylor, commander of the British 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment, was given the post of camp commandant. Fearing possible prisoner mutinies, Kramer unsuccessfully attempted to deny members of the British Army access to the camp. However, they made their way to the camp and informed the prisoners of their arrival. Shortly afterwards, some prisoners attempted to break into the prisoners' kitchen and potato cellar. The camp's SS, Hungarian soldiers from the neighbouring tank shooting school who had been ordered to protect it from the British, opened fire. British officers immediately prevented this. After that, a British officer pointed his pistol at Kramer and forced him to take a wounded prisoner to the hospital. On April 17, 1945, Kramer was arrested, placed under arrest and marched through the camp in shackles. After several interrogations, he was sent to the Cell POW camp on April 18, 1945. In early May 1945, he was briefly transferred to Diest, Belgium, and then brought back to Cell. During the interrogations, Kramer willingly provided information. He described his CV and also commented on the crimes he had committed. For example, he admitted to having carried out the gassing of 86 Jews at the Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp, which he had carried out as an order taker without feeling anything. For these reasons, Kramer was dubbed the Beast of Belsen by the British public. From 17 September 1945, he and 44 other Belsen camp staff members were to answer before a British military tribunal for war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Bergen-Belsen trial. The event took place in the Lüneburg Municipal Gymnasium, which had been specially renovated for this purpose. In his case, not only were crimes committed at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp on trial, but also crimes committed at the Auschwitz concentration camp, as was the case with 10 other defendants. At the beginning of the trial, he pleaded not guilty like all the other defendants. Only his wife Rosina, a stenotypist with whom he had been married since October 1937 and with whom he had 3 children, testified in Kramer's favor. On November 17, 1945, Kramer was sentenced to death by hanging. As early as November 18, he petitioned Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery for clemency. In it, he shifted responsibility for the catastrophic conditions at Bergen-Belsen to his superiors, referred to war-related circumstances, and described himself as an order-taker who had fulfilled his duty selflessly and without consideration. He had not cowardly fled before the camp was surrendered, but had conscientiously remained on the premises out of concern for the prisoners entrusted to him, and concluded the following: I am completely innocent of the crimes of which I am accused at Bergen-Belsen, as well as at Auschwitz. I am not a war criminal. I did not kill anyone on my own initiative. I was merely a soldier, and as such I was carrying out the orders of my military superiors. These were his last words before the judges. However, his request for clemency was not granted. He was finally executed on the 13th of December 1945 at the Hamelin Penitentiary, where Kramer's executioner was Albert Pierre Point. Rudolf Hoss, the ruthless and greatest genocide of the Second World War. Rudolf Hoss was born on November 25, 1901, in Baden. His ancestors were primarily farmers and craftsmen from Baden. Hoss, for his part, described in his autobiography that he came from the family of a former officer. His father, the merchant Franz Höss, wanted him to become a Catholic priest, states Höss in his autobiography. After his father's death on the 3rd of May 1914, Höss remained at school and supposedly volunteered for the army during the First World War. Höss claims to have served in Turkey on the front lines in Mesopotamia and later in Palestine, and to have taken part in combat operations against the British Army. At the age of 17, he claims to have been awarded the Iron Cross first and second class. However, these claims have now been refuted. After the Buhl Secondary School refused to accept him, he returned to Mannheim in the autumn of 1915. There he lived with his mother and siblings. The family's living conditions are said to have been poor after his father's death. Höss became a soldier in 1918 and joined the Freikorps Rossbach in 1919, with whom he participated in battles in the Baltic states, the Ruhr region, and Upper Silesia. After the Freikorps were banned, he worked on farms in Silesia and Mecklenburg. There he came into contact with National Socialist ideology. When Rossbach and his followers joined the National Socialist Party in late 1922, Höss believed that he too had become a member, as he stated in his autobiography. However, disagreements later arose between various party offices over the timing of his joining the party. In Gut Neuhof near Parchim, Höss led a work team of the Rossbachers in 1923. At that time, Martin Bormann was the general manager of the neighboring manor in Herzberg, branch leader of the German People's Freedom Party in the Herzberg area and of the Rossbach organization in Mecklenburg. Walter Kaddow also worked at the Herzberg estate, having joined the Rossbach work group in the fall of 1922 after attending a teacher's seminar due to financial difficulties. Bormann and Höss wanted to punish the unpopular Kaddow for various embezzlements and possibly suspected him of being a communist informer. On May 31, 1923, Höss and some other Rossbachers kidnapped Kaddow from a forest outside Parchim, severely mistreated him, finally killed him, and buried his body in the forest the next day. The crime, which became known as the Parchim Femimord, was discovered by one of the participants in front of the Social Democrats' Vorwärts. On March 15, 1924, Höss was sentenced to 10 years in prison by the state court for the protection of the Republic. His later patron, Bormann, was sentenced to 1 year in prison for his role in the Parchim Femimord. Höss was released on the 14th of July 1928 as a result of the Koch amnesty. Promoted to SS Unterscharführer on 20 November 1934, Höss completed special infantry training with the Guards at Dachau concentration camp from December 1934 to January 1935. On 1 March 1935, he was transferred to Department 2 at Dachau and promoted to SS Oberscharführer on the 1st of July. On 1st March 1936, he became SS Untersturmführer and a month later camp leader of protective custody. He was thus in charge of controlling the number of prisoners, managing the prisoner's office and, like his superior, assigning block leaders. He also carried out sentences in concentration camps or supervised their execution. His superiors judged him excellently. Since he was serving his prison sentence during the Nazi Party's ban and at the time of its re-establishment in February 1925, Höss was unable to apply for new party membership at that time and did not have a membership card at the time of his induction into the SS. In November 1936, the Reich leadership of the Nazi Party informed the local Death's Head Association that Höss was not listed with membership number 3240, but rather another party member. Höss was to be removed from the local group's inventory management until further notice. On August 2, 1937, he applied to join the party. since he had not received a membership card until 1939, also due to the ban on admission imposed in 1933. Bormann intervened with the Reich Party leadership, and Höss was admitted on the 3rd of April 1939, retroactively to the 1st of May 1937. He also attempted to be awarded the Order of the Blood, which he did not receive. In August 1938, Höss became adjutant to the commandant of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and in November 1939, head of the custody camp with the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer. There he was responsible for the murder of the Sass brothers, who had been transferred there in March 1940. In addition, Höss led execution squads at his position in Sachsenhausen, including the shooting of the so-called Bible students. In May 1940, he was transferred to Auschwitz concentration camp as camp commandant. On March 1, 1941, Höss received orders from Himmler to build the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. In the summer of 1941, he was sent to Himmler in Berlin. The latter explained that the Führer had ordered the final solution to the Jewish question and that he was to carry out this task. Shortly thereafter, Höss received a visit from Adolf Eichmann of the Reich Main Security Office at Auschwitz. He gave an approximate number of transports and made it clear that only gas would be possible for the destruction, since the expected masses could not be eliminated by shooting. Incidentally, this was too great a burden for the SS men because of the women and children, according to Eichmann. In the autumn of 1941, Höss's representative, Hauptsturmführer Karl had Soviet prisoners of war gassed with Zyklon B on his own authority. Höss was on a business trip at the time. He agreed with Eichmann on this method. Fritsch later boasted of being the inventor of the Auschwitz gas chambers and of Zyklon B having been the first to be successfully used for mass extermination. Rudolf Höss directed the extermination of the Jews at Auschwitz, which began around 1941 and 1942. They were murdered in 2 farmhouses that had been temporarily converted into gas chambers. At the end of 1942, construction began on 4 large crematoria with gas chambers, which were used for mass murders beginning in March 1943. In November 1943, SS Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl, as head of the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, divided the office of the Central Commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camps. In the course of this, on November 10, 1943, Höss was entrusted with the management of business at the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office and was appointed to Oranienburg for this purpose. In May 1944, Oswald Pohl ordered a change in the camp commandants assigned to the Auschwitz concentration camp complex and at the same time appointed Höss as camp chief at Auschwitz. In this role, he organized the so-called Hungarian Action, the mass murder of Hungarian Jews, and was also involved in the induction of the then newly appointed camp commandants Richard Baer and Josef Kramer. After Höss left the Auschwitz concentration camp complex in July 1944, Baer took over the role of camp leader. From November 1944, Höss worked at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. His family also lived in the vicinity of the town from late 1944. After the completion of the gas chamber at Ravensbrück, he coordinated the mass murders there. Following the end of the war, Rudolf Höss managed to escape to Flensburg in May 1945. While housing his wife and 5 children in St. Michaelisden, he created a new identity under the name Franz Lang as a naval officer at the naval school in Mürwik. After a short period as a British prisoner of war, he went into hiding as a farm assistant on a farm in Gottrupel in the Flensburg countryside with the help of his brother-in-law Gerhard Fritz Hensel. There he was, located by Hans Alexander of the War Crimes Investigation Team and arrested by the British military police on 11 March 1946. Höss's hiding place and new identity were revealed by his wife Hedwig after she had been threatened that her eldest son would be deported to Siberia if she did not agree to cooperate. When arrested, Höss denied being the wanted man, but could be identified by his wedding ring. After his capture, Rudolf Höss was interrogated several times by the British 92nd Camp Security Section in Haide and Minden. On 14 March 1946, he signed an interrogation protocol in German, in which he gave detailed information about the mass extermination at Auschwitz. He then appeared at the Nuremberg trial of major war criminals as a defense witness for Ernst Kaltenbrunner. He again gave detailed information about the mass extermination on the 1st and 2nd of April 1946 during interrogations during his appearance as a witness, and finally on the 24th of April 1946 in a handwritten statement written by him. According to his statements in Nuremberg, Höss was extradited to Poland by the American authorities in accordance with the Moscow Declaration of 1943. On May 25, 1946, he flew from Nuremberg via Berlin to Warsaw. On July 30th, he was taken to Krakow by train with Amon. Goth, commandant of the Plazow concentration camp, was indicted before the Supreme National Court of Poland. While in custody in Poland, Höss wrote his autobiography with extensive notes on the events at the Auschwitz concentration camp. During the trial, held from March 11th to 29th, 1947 in Warsaw, he contributed to the clarification of many historical issues with his testimony. Apparently, until the very end, he did not understand why he was being held responsible, since he had only followed orders. Finally, on April 2nd, 1947, Höss was sentenced to death, and the execution took place on April 16, 1947, on the grounds of the Auschwitz concentration camp, opposite his former residence overlooking the camp. Amon Goth, the butcher of Plazow. Amon Leopold Goth was born on November 11, 1908, in the Vienna district of Gumpendorf, the only child of Amon Franz Goth and his wife Bertha Goth. The boy's baptism took place on the 18th of December of the same year in the parish church of Gumpendorf. At that time, his parents ran a joint book and art trading business, which specialized primarily in the distribution of religious writings and military works. Their earnings enabled the family to lead a middle-class lifestyle. However, due to their business activities, Amon's parents found little time to care for their son. The boy therefore largely grew up with a childless aunt on his father's side. In 1915, Amon Goth began school at a private elementary school. However, he showed little interest in teaching, so his academic performance remained poor. As a result, in 1920 he was placed in the care of a strictly run Catholic boarding school in Weidhofen by his tutors, where he was to lay the foundation for a later successful professional life at the local secondary school. These hopes were not fulfilled. Instead, Goth, who was perceived by those around him as rebellious, developed an aversion to the authority of teachers. In the summer of 1925, he finally discontinued his school education without graduating and began working as an apprentice bookseller for a publishing house in his parents' company. It was during this time that Goth, then 17, began to become seriously interested in National Socialism and its ideology. In the context of the swastikas and other German nationalist groups, his anti-Semitic worldview was subsequently consolidated. Around 1927, Goth joined the paramilitary association of the Styrian Heritage Society in Vienna. Historian Johannes Sachslehner suspects that this step was a search by Goth for possible career alternatives. In this context, he is also said to have attempted, albeit unsuccessfully, to study agriculture. Despite the aforementioned efforts, Goth soon became disillusioned with national security. In particular, he was bothered by the lack of radicalism there and the discord among the country's leaders, so he returned to the swastikas around 1929 and 1930. On January 24, 1940, he joined his father's company in the 6th district of Vienna in Maria-Hilfer-Straße as a partner. The successes of the aspiring National Socialists in the 1930 Reichstag elections in the German Reich prompted Goth to join the Nazi Party on 13 May 1931 in the Vienna local group in Margaretten. After a purely formal transfer to the Viennese local group Mariahilf, he took over the duties of political administrator there. Striving for a rapid career, Goth applied for admission to the Schutzstaffel in the same year. After a positive decision on his application, he was assigned to the Daimel Squadron, a Viennese SS sub-formation for service. In January 1933, he was transferred to Krems as staff adjutant of the 52nd SS Standard Danube. In addition, he was appointed head of the motorized squadron. In the latter role, Goth, who had held the rank of SS Scharführer since May 1933, suffered severe injuries in a traffic accident with the 11th SS Standard near Drosendorf. Referring to this, he applied in vain to acquire the Order of the Blood. Goeth's personal role in the so-called July Putsch of the National Socialists in Krems in the summer of 1934 and the subsequent banning of the Austrian Nazi Party remains controversial today and is the subject of numerous disputes. What is certain is that Goth evaded police pursuit by fleeing to Munich, where he found refuge with a dog breeder. From there, he worked as a smuggler and messenger in the German-Austrian border area. In October 1933, however, Goth was located in his homeland by judicial officials and taken into custody. The legal proceedings against him ended in December 1933 with an acquittal due to lack of evidence. Goth subsequently returned to his parents' business but continued to maintain contacts with the Nazi underground. This relatively stable period in his life was cut short by the death of his mother in March 1936 and the failure of Goth's first marriage in the summer of the same year. Bored with selling books and motivated by his desire to continue serving in the SS, Goth eventually moved to Munich in 1937. After the annexation of Austria, he returned to Vienna in the spring of 1938, where he was assigned to SS Standard 11. In the autumn of the same year, he remarried. Following the outbreak of World War II, Goth volunteered for the Waffen-SS in March 1940. He was assigned the duties of administrative leader in the Eastern Operations Command in Upper Silesia with its headquarters in Teschen. According to his own statements, he was entrusted with the registration of horse and other farm animal populations, among other things. However, this activity was short-lived, as in the autumn of 1940, Goth, now as treasurer, moved to the office of the Volksdeutsche Mittelstelle in Katowice, a sort of contact and coordination office for ethnic Germans willing to relocate. In this position, he was promoted to SS Oberscharführer in January 1941 and to SS Untersturmführer on November 9, 1941. His service evaluations to date have all been unobjectionable. The reasons and circumstances surrounding Goth's assignment to the general government in Lublin, annexed by the German Reich to Odilow's staff Globoknik's experiences in the spring of 1942, are speculative. It is possible that personal contacts or his reputation as a good organizer played a role in this. At that time, in addition to the alleged masterminds of the ongoing Reinhardt operation, police and SS teams assigned to this purpose were stationed in the former school building on Pirakistrasse, including murderers and war criminals. It is possible that Goth became radicalized by leaps and bounds in the environment of these men and their practiced racial delusions of annihilation. However, Goth was still exempt from such murderous actions. Instead, he was initially entrusted with supervising construction as part of the expansion of the existing SS labor camp in Budzin, where additional barracks were built for around 2,000 forced laborers, mainly Jews, from the Könskovola ghetto. Goth subsequently participated in organizing the selection measures for the evacuation of the Belzec ghetto and the deportation of those incapable of work, the elderly and children, to the Majdanek concentration camp. In addition to the countless atrocities committed by members of the SS Einsatzgruppen, Goeth's hundreds of bribes, so-called ransoms, are also documented, which would establish his later reputation as a corrupt officer. However, embezzlement of loot, which mainly consisted of valuable furs, skins, and precious stones, was revealed. The investigation procedure initiated against Goth, however, was without consequences. During the summer of 1942, Goth was entrusted with the procurement of building materials for what SS jargon called secret construction measures. Presumably, this involved the requisitioning of raw materials and materials for the construction of the crematoria at the Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka extermination camps. However, the access permission he was granted to the aforementioned warehouses could also have been related to the inspection and search of the artwork and valuables stored there. From October 1942, Goth was entrusted with supervising the construction of the conversion of the Poniatowa POW camp into a labor camp for Jewish forced laborers. Around the same time, he began the expansion of the Płaszów labor camp, whose capacity was to be expanded to include the able-bodied Jews of the Krakow ghetto. However, since construction activities had progressed very slowly, the local head of the SS and police commissioned Amon Goth, whom he already knew from his time in Munich, was asked to oversee the construction in February 1943. At the same time, he was offered the possibility of becoming the camp's commandant upon its completion, which he accepted. Goth's first task in his new sphere of activity was the ruthless expulsion of the Polish families still living in the vicinity of the camp from their homes. At the same time, he adjusted the timetable for the completion of the new barracks under threat of the death penalty. Goth made use of this latter action on the 5th of March 1943, when he noticed the absence of 2 women during the daily morning roll call and then randomly shot 2 Jewish kapos standing nearby with his service weapon in a fit of rage. The missing women were located later in the day and, on Goth's orders, were publicly hanged on the campgrounds. The labor camp inmates soon became aware of the special role of their new commandant's headdress. In addition to building barracks, the convicts were also responsible for constructing brick barracks for SS officers and men. As commandant of Płaszów, Goth initially lived in the so-called Red House on Jerozolimska Street, which was not far from the camp's main entrance. Drunkenness was rife there. Later, he moved to a villa above the camp, which had been specially renovated for him. Daily life in the camp was subject to Goth's strict orders and was characterized by arbitrary executions, harassment, humiliation, and torture by himself or the guards. After the morning roll call, the prisoners were led to their assigned work. Attempts at escape or sabotage were usually punishable by death, while smuggling food, for example, was punishable by 100 lashes. Successful escapes were punished by the execution of 1 in 10 of the escaped prisoners. It was not uncommon for Goth to do this personally. He believed that with such measures he could memorably demonstrate his ideas of order and discipline. However, due to his habit of indiscriminately shooting prisoners from the balcony of his villa in the morning with a bolt-action rifle, he was nicknamed the Butcher of Płaszów by the prisoners early on. He killed at least 500 people with his bare hands. After murdering a person, he asked for their information so that their relatives would also be killed, as he didn't want to have dissatisfied people in the camp. It has also been reported that Goth killed indiscriminately almost every day. A misinterpreted glance was enough for this, so the prisoners preferred to look at the ground in Goth's presence. His raids on the barracks at irregular intervals in search of hidden valuables of any kind primarily served his personal enrichment, for example, with diamonds or foreign currency. Goth forced information about the hiding places under threat of the death penalty, but mostly with the use of a whip. He accumulated the goods looted in this way in an armored safe in his villa. On the other hand, bulky items such as paintings, carpets, and furniture were sold by middlemen on the black market, and the profits were pocketed. He also treated SS subordinates harshly, bringing them before SS and police tribunals for the slightest offenses. Because of this, the camp staff split into 2 groups, a clique of loyal followers and those who disliked Goth or even hated him. For his services and achievements in the construction of the Płaszów camp, Goth was promoted to SS Hauptsturmführer on 28 July 1943 by the higher SS and police leader East. Goth's persistent black market dealings, his strict behavior towards his subordinates, and his dissolute lifestyle led to a complaint from other SS members in the summer of 1944. In May 1943, a previously initiated case against him for customs evasion had been closed without consequences. SS Obersturmbannführer and SS Judge Konrad Morgan were responsible for handling the new complaint and initiated the appropriate investigative steps. In the course of these investigations, a first wagon containing Goeth's looted goods was seized at Oppau station at the end of August 1944, with others to follow. Goeth was arrested by Gestapo officers at his villa in Płaszów on 13 September 1944. The arrest warrant issued by an SS court and the Krakow police was based on suspicions of appropriating valuables and money from Jewish prisoners for personal gain and of improper treatment of prisoners. After a stay in Vienna, probably to be allowed to attend to personal matters, Goeth was brought before an SS court of honor. While Schörner, who was indicted at the same time, was demoted on the same charges and transferred to the special SS unit Dirlewanger on parole at the front, Goeth was released on bail. Presumably, however, he was not completely free in the following months, but was at least temporarily detained at Dachau. At the end of January 1945, Goeth visited Schindler for the last time at his new production center in Brunlitz, Moravia, possibly to secure the valuables he had deposited there or to appropriate parts of them. He then went to a Viennese military hospital for medical treatment for a duodenal ulcer. There, after confiscating his personal loot, Goth was arrested by the field police on 17 February 1945 and then taken to the Munich prison on remand via the Rossauer police building. Pending a retrial, Goth was arrested there on 27 April 1945 by members of the SS Field Police, forcibly drafted into the armed forces, and assigned to the replacement regiment stationed in Munich. However, due to his still poor health, he was admitted from there to a military hospital in Baden-Württemberg. Tölz. In Bad Tölz, Goth was arrested in early May 1945 by officials of the United States Counterintelligence Corps on suspicion of possible war crimes committed at the Dachau concentration camp and placed under arrest. However, he managed to conceal his true origins by assuming a false identity. In correspondence with his relatives, he complained, among other things, of a lack of food and drink, as well as decent clothing. At the beginning of 1946, Goth, who was imprisoned in the central compound for suspects and witnesses of war crimes at Dachau, hoped to be released soon. In January 1946, Goth requested a review of the reasons for his detention. In it, he stated that he had never actively participated in the Dachau concentration camp and that the corresponding suspicions against him had only arisen because he had been detained together with members of the SS from that camp. For further justification, he vaguely stated that he had been active in the Krakow area, prompting American authorities to conduct further investigations into his character. Faced with new evidence, Goth eventually admitted during interrogation in February 1946 that he had been the commandant of Płaszów, but at the same time attempted to downplay or minimize the crimes committed there and the conditions at the camp. However, his statements were refuted by numerous testimonies from surviving inmates. At the end of May 1946, Goth was handed over to the Polish judicial authorities along with the former commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp, Rudolf Höss. On July 30, 1946, the two former Nazi commandants arrived en masse at Krakow's main railway station and were greeted by an angry crowd. However, their intention to lynch was not directed against Rudolf Höss but against Goth, who was to be protected by security personnel specially assigned for this purpose. The trial began on August 27, 1946, before the Supreme National Court in Krakow in the largest courtroom of the local district court, under intense media attention. In addition to numerous representatives of the press, the trial was attended primarily by Jewish victims of Goth's reign of terror. In order to thwart Goeth's expected defense strategy, invoking the laws of war, the court had an international law expert explain beforehand that the Nazi regime in Poland between 1939 and 1945 was not a war in the true sense of the word, but an attack, and that the crimes committed should therefore also be assessed according to Polish law. However, the court's fears remained unfounded. Instead of the expected intelligent move, Goeth followed the simple practice of rigorously denying all accusations against him. Testifying about the acts of violence committed, he questioned the credibility of witnesses and defended his actions by saying that he had only followed orders as a soldier and therefore denied any responsibility. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming and his guilt was undisputed from the outset. In the final argument on September 3, 1946, the prosecution demanded the death penalty, which should be considered the only appropriate punishment in view of the defendant's actions and the special importance of the trial. Goeth's defense attorneys also followed this view and asked the High Court for a just verdict. In his final remarks, Goeth complained that he had had too little time to present defense witnesses on individual charges and that, as commandant of Płaszów, he should bear full responsibility for the actions of his subordinates. Otherwise, he pleaded not guilty within the meaning of the indictment. 2 days later, on September 5, 1946, Goeth was found guilty on all 5 counts by the court and sentenced to death by hanging. His petition for clemency, which he handed to the chairman of the National People's Council, was rejected. In his petition for clemency, Goeth described his plea in the third person, invoked the soldiers' obedience to orders, and also referred to the German legal situation at the time, which he was unable to evade. On September 13, 1946, 8 days after the verdict, Goeth was handed over to his executioner. The exact deadline had previously been kept secret by the court due to fears of public unrest. The execution took place around 6 p.m. in Krakow's Montelupik prison. In addition to the executioner and the prison director, representatives of the prosecution as well as a doctor and a clergyman participated. The convict's hands were tied behind his back on the way to the gallows and subsequent execution. The smooth execution of the sentence was thwarted by the fact that the rope prepared proved to be too long. It had to be shortened twice due to Goth's height. Only the third attempt was successful. Goth's last words were, "Heil Hitler." Finally, his body was cremated and his ashes scattered in the Vistula. Karl Otto Koch, the crimes of the commander of Buchenwald. Koch was born in Darmstadt on August 2, 1897, in the then Grand Duchy of Hesse. Koch was the son of a registrar. After graduating from secondary school, he completed an apprenticeship as a bookkeeper. Against his mother's wishes, Koch volunteered for the German army during World War I and served as a rifleman in the 153rd Infantry Regiment from March 1916. Koch was wounded twice on the Western Front and after scouting behind enemy lines toward the end of the war was taken prisoner of war by the British, from whom he was released in October 1919. He then worked as an accountant for a short time, and in the early 1920s he initially received a permanent position as a bank clerk at the German Agricultural and Commercial Bank. Koch was employed by at least 7 companies between 1922 and 1930, and in 1928 it was proven that he had stolen cash. Due to document forgery and embezzlement, Koch was sentenced to a short prison term in 1930 and became unemployed after his release. After marrying in 1924, Koch became the father of a son. He was divorced in 1931 due to acts of infidelity. He joined the Nazi Party on March 1, 1931, and in September 1931 he also became a member of the SS. Initially, he acted as honorary treasurer of his local group, and from 1932 worked as an instructor for the 33rd SS Standarte in Kassel. His task there included the establishment of an auxiliary police force which was subordinated to the SS main units in mid-1933. Koch was briefly expelled from the party during 1932 for unknown reasons. From September 1933 he built the Sonderkommando, Sachsen in Section 2 of the SS. From the end of June 1934 he was commandant of the Hohenstein concentration camp, and then from 1 October 1934 briefly commandant of the Sachsenberg concentration camp. From 8 November 1934 he acted as head of the guard troop at the Esterwegen concentration camp. From the end of February 1935 he was head of a detention camp at the Lichtenberg concentration camp, and from 1 April 1935 adjutant at the Dachau concentration camp. On 31 March 1936 he became commandant of the Esterwegen concentration camp, in July 1936 first commandant of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and finally in mid-July 1937 first commandant of the Buchenwald concentration camp. Koch was married to Ilse Koch, née Köhler, since May 1937. He had met her in 1934 while working in Sachsenberg, where she had worked as his secretary. With his wife Ilse, who became known as the Witch of Buchenwald, after the war, Karl Otto Koch moved there to the SS Führersiedlung Buchenwald Villa. Between 1938 and 1941 their 3 children were born, who grew up in the immediate vicinity of the camp. The marriage is said to have been unhappy, as Koch was unfaithful to him and Ilse Koch. From 1941 he spent a short time in Norway to build up the concentration camp system there. Koch was commandant of the Buchenwald concentration camp until December 1941. In November 1941, Josias to Waldeck and Piermont, higher SS and police chief of military district 9th, and therefore also responsible for the Buchenwald concentration camp, summoned Koch. There he confronted Koch with accusations of corruption, as he was said to have enriched himself with the assets of Jewish prisoners taken to the Buchenwald concentration camp. Koch was then disarmed and arrested. An investigation was opened before an SS and police tribunal in Kassel. However, following the intervention of Oswald Pohl and Richard Glucks, Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler ordered Koch's immediate release and decreed that in the future no high-ranking SS leader could be arrested without his order. After the suppression of the proceedings, Koch received a congratulatory letter from Pohl in which he assured him that he would intervene protectively if once again an unemployed lawyer should wish to extend his executioner's hands to Koch's white body. Buchenwald concentration camp to Majdanek concentration camp thanks to Himmler's intervention, where he again became camp commandant. After the escape of 86 Soviet prisoners from Majdanek on July 14, 1942, he was initially granted leave of absence in August 1942 due to negligence in the release of prisoners. After that, Koch was transferred to Eger as an SS liaison officer for postal protection. On February 17, 1943, the proceedings against Koch for negligence in the release of prisoners were discontinued, but his transfer from the Waffen-SS to the Allgemeine SS was upheld. Meanwhile, Josias to Waldeck and Pyrmont had conducted further investigations into the corruption affair surrounding Koch by having camp administration documents viewed and evaluated if still available. While probing the death lists of the Buchenwald concentration camp, he came across the names of Walter Kramer and Karl Pikes, both prisoner nurses who had supposedly been shot while fleeing in the Goslar subcamp on 6 November 1941. Kramer was known to Josias of Waldeck and Pyrmont, as the latter had successfully treated him for furunculosis. Koch, as was shown after further investigations, had also been treated by Kramer for syphilis, as he, like many other SS leaders, preferred the treatment of prisoner nurses to treatment by SS doctors. Kramer and Pike were therefore unwanted witnesses. Furthermore, Kramer also knew about Koch's embezzlement. These murders, ordered by Koch, would later be proven to him and ultimately formed the main basis for the murder charge. Pyrmont also interviewed members of the Guard and prisoners. He sent the results of the investigation to Heinrich Himmler, who allowed him to continue the investigation, but initially with regard to the personal enrichment of Koch and his wife. Eventually, with Heinrich Himmler's consent, the investigations were transferred by the SS and Police Tribunal in Kassel to SS Judge Konrad Morgan, who was already overseeing the Koch's accounts and correspondence. After extensive investigations at Buchenwald concentration camp, Morgan uncovered a corruption affair of immense proportions that went far beyond the Koch case. During searches of the quarters of Koch's former employees, Morgan found large amounts of money, jewelry, and pieces of dental gold from prisoners murdered with the assistance of the criminal police. In addition, further murders and attempted murders of prisoners were uncovered, which may have taken place on Koch's orders due to their complicity or willingness to testify. On 24 August 1943, Koch was finally arrested again by the Gestapo for corruption and the murder of 3 prisoners along with his wife in their official quarters at the Buchenwald concentration camp. The couple were taken to the Weimar stables. The arrests took place with the participation of Konrad Morgan. After a vigorous interrogation of Konrad Morgan, Koch confirmed the accusations against him. In addition, other members of the commandant's staff and guards were arrested as accomplices, such as Koch's adjutant, the head of the detention block, and the camp doctor. By the end of the summer of 1943, potential prosecution witnesses had been treated in clinics for acute symptoms of poisoning, such as Hackmann's wife and the father of an SS Unterscharführer arrested in the context of this criminal complex. However, despite the deceased's autopsy and subsequent investigations, the poisonings could not initially be attributed to a single perpetrator, nor could it be proven that they were based on Koch's orders. After the results of the investigation into the Buchenwald corruption affair became known on April 11, 1944, the indictment against the accused was issued on August 17, 1944. In September 1944, the trial of the accused began before the SS and Police Tribunal in Kassel, which was now operating for special purposes to investigate and try unauthorized concentration camp crimes. The trial was held behind closed doors and a total of 22 witnesses, both SS men and prisoners, were heard. The proceedings against the Kochs were later heard separately. The charges were corruption, murder, and assault with a fatal outcome. The verdicts against the Kochs were announced in December 1944. Koch was sentenced to death twice for murder, receiving stolen property, fraud, embezzlement, and incitement. Other participants, Hermann Hackmann and Hermann Florstedt, were also sentenced to death, possibly also Hoven. Johann Blank is said to have hanged himself in the bunker at Buchenwald concentration camp after his arrest in February 1944. Waldemar Hoven and Martin Sommer were released from prison towards the end of the war. Sommer was still on parole at the front, where he was seriously wounded. Ilse Koch was acquitted in these proceedings and released. Shortly before the end of the war, Karl Otto Koch was executed by an SS firing squad at Buchenwald concentration camp on the 5th of April 1945. According to the written recollections of August Bender, who was present at the execution as a doctor, Koch's last words were, "Boys, shoot well.